The punch never landed. Brandon Keller's fist stopped an inch from Caleb Whitmore's jaw, frozen trembling, because the mechanic's hand had already closed around his wrist like a steel trap. And 200 people watching in that warehouse suddenly stopped breathing. Nobody in Westbridge knew that the grease-stained man they'd laughed at 10 minutes earlier had once given killer hold orders in rooms where hesitation meant body bags. But before you find out how far that hand would go, drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe, because where this story goes next, you will not see coming. The bell above the door of Whitmore Auto Repair hadn't rung in 4 hours, and Caleb Whitmore was grateful for the silence. He stood over the open hood of a 2009 Silverado 4Arms, slick with grease up to the elbow, a wrench in his right hand, and a headache building behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the engine in front of him. The shop smelled like it always did, motor oil rubber, and the faint metallic tang of a space heater running too hot in the corner, because the furnace had gone out again last winter, and he still hadn't gotten around to fixing it. Fixing everyone else's problems. Never his own. Dad? He looked up. Lily stood in the doorway that connected the shop to the little office where she did her homework after school, her backpack still slung over one shoulder, her socks not matching one green one with cartoon dinosaurs on it, because she'd dressed herself again that morning while he was already gone to open up. 8 years old and already more responsible than half the men Caleb had served with. Hey, Bug. He set the wrench down on the fender, careful the way he set down everything, like the world might shatter if he wasn't. Homework done. Mostly. She chewed her lip. The kid had a tell she always chewed her lip right before she said something she'd been rehearsing. Mrs. Alvarez said the field trip form is due tomorrow, and it's $40. And Danny's mom said the bus, the school bus that we ride Miss Carter said something about the transmission, and now they need a different one, and it's going to cost more for the field trip because they have to rent one and... Slow down! Caleb wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his back pocket and crouched down to her eye level, the way he always did when something was weighing on her. What's really going on? Lily's eyes dropped to the concrete floor. The truck's making that noise again, the one from before. And I heard you on the phone last night. You said I don't have it to somebody, too. Caleb felt his jaw tighten just slightly, just enough that he had to consciously release it. 8 years old, and she'd been listening at doors the way kids do, the way kids always do when their parents think they're asleep. That's grown-up stuff, he said gently. Not something you need to carry. But it's about money. For the truck. Because it makes the car... She stopped herself, corrected. The bus. It makes the bus that takes me to school. And if you don't have... Lily! He put both hands on her small shoulders. I've got it handled. I promise you. You are never ever going to miss a field trip because of money. That's a promise and I don't break those. You know that. She studied his face for a long moment, the way she always did when she was deciding whether to believe him, and then she nodded, satisfied. Because in 8 years, Caleb Whitmore had never once broken a promise to his daughter, and some part of her, the trusting part, the part he prayed to God he'd never have to disappoint, believed he never would. Okay, she said. Can I have a snack? Fruit snacks are in the drawer, not the whole bag. She grinned and disappeared back into the office, and Caleb straightened up slowly, feeling every one of his 39 years settle into his lower back, and looked at the calendar tacked to the wall by the tool bench. Friday, which meant the transmission shop's invoice for the parts he'd need to fix his own truck, the one currently making a grinding noise every time he shifted into third, was due Monday. 600 and change. And after this week's slow business, after the Hendersons had canceled their brake job, after he'd let old Pete Dawkins slide on his bill again, because the man was 71 and living on Social Security, and Caleb didn't have it in him to squeeze a retired plumber for money he didn't have. After all of that, Caleb had exactly $140 in the shop's account, and rent on the building was due the 15th. He sat down on the rolling stool by the workbench and put his face in his hands for exactly 10 seconds. That was the rule he'd set for himself years ago, 10 seconds to feel it, whatever it was, And then you got back up because feeling sorry for yourself, never fixed a transmission, never paid a bill, never kept a promise to an 8-year-old with mismatched socks who believed her father hung the moon. 10 seconds. He counted them in his head the way he'd counted seconds in rooms far darker than this one, and then he stood up. His phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from Ray Dobbins, an old customer, an old friend. One of the few people in Westbridge who knew Caleb from before he'd bought the shop, back when Caleb had first rolled into town 4 years ago with nothing but a truck, a duffel bag, and a little girl who'd just lost her mother. "You still short on cash, brother? There's a thing tonight. Iron Valley. Cash game, not cards fighting. Some rich kid putting up 500 to anybody who can last 3 minutes with him. Half this town's gone to watch him make fools of guys. Thought of you 'cause I know you used to box or whatever back in the day. Easy money if you're desperate enough. Just saying." Caleb read it twice. Then he read it a third time. Used to box or whatever back in the day. Ray didn't know the half of it. Nobody in Westbridge knew the half of it. As far as anyone in this town was concerned, Caleb Whitmore was a quiet mechanic who kept to himself, raised his daughter. Wright went to church on the Sundays. He could manage it and had a service record he never talked about because when people asked he said, "Infantry," and changed the subject, and people, decent small-town people, respected a veteran's silence and didn't push. They didn't know about Lieutenant Caleb Whitmore. They didn't know about 11 years in the teams, 4 deployments, 4 countries he still wasn't allowed to name in casual conversation. They didn't know about the compound outside Kandahar or the extraction in Yemen that had gone sideways in the worst 9 minutes of his life, or the 2 men, Danny Ortiz and Marcus Webb, his brothers, his actual brothers in every way that mattered, who hadn't made it home from that mission, whose names Caleb still said quietly to himself every single morning before the sun came up, a private ritual nobody witnessed. Nobody. They didn't know that Caleb had left the Navy, not because his body gave out, though it had taken its share of damage, but because something in him had finally broken in a different way. The part that could keep doing this. Keep watching friends die. Keep carrying secrets that ate a man alive from the inside. And he'd looked at his newborn daughter, 3 weeks old, held in the shaking arms of a wife he'd barely gotten to know because he was always gone, and he had made a decision. He was done. He was going to be a father, a real one. Present. Ordinary. Alive. His wife Sarah hadn't gotten the chance to see much of that decision play out. A drunk driver on a rain-slicked highway had taken her 4 years ago when Lily was 4 years old, and Caleb had packed up everything they owned and driven until the ache in his chest felt slightly less like drowning, and that drive had ended in Westbridge, a town he'd chosen for no reason he could fully explain, except that it felt far enough from everything and close enough to nothing. He'd bought a failings auto shop with his last savings and the small life insurance payout, and he'd built slowly, painfully a life. A quiet one. A humble one. The kind of life where nobody looked at him twice, where nobody knew what his hands had done, where the only violence in his world was the occasional stuck bolt or stripped screw. He stared at Ray's text. Easy money if you're desperate enough. Caleb almost laughed. Desperate wasn't the word he'd have chosen, but it wasn't far off either. $500 would cover the transmission parts, with enough left over to make sure Lily's field trip form got signed and paid tomorrow morning before she even woke up, so she'd never have to know there'd been a single second of doubt. He looked toward the office door, where he could hear Lily humming something to herself, some song from a cartoon off-key, and happy, and utterly unaware that her father was standing in a garage doing math with dread in his stomach. 3 minutes, Caleb thought. How hard could 3 minutes possibly be? He didn't know Brandon Keller. He didn't know the man's record, his training, his reputation. He didn't care. In Caleb's mind, this wasn't a fight. Fights were things that happened between equals, between men who respected each other enough to hurt each other honestly. This was closer to a transaction. Stand there. Take a few hits if it came to that. Don't get seriously hurt. Walk away with the money. Simple. He was wrong about almost all of it, though he wouldn't understand exactly how wrong until he was standing in the middle of that ring 3 hours later. He texted Ray back, "What time?" The reply came almost instantly, like Ray had been waiting with his thumb over the screen. 8 p.m. Iron Valley Warehouse off Route 9. Bring cash for the buy-in, $20 refundable if you don't fight. You serious? Yeah, Caleb typed. I'm serious. At 6:30, Caleb closed the shop early, which he almost never did, and drove home in his truck with the grinding third gear wincing every time he shifted. His house sat on 2 acres just outside town, a modest single story he'd bought because it had a fenced yard and a good school district. Nothing fancy, everything functional. Lily was in the back seat, kicking her feet against the seat in front of her, chattering about a girl in her class named Emma, who'd apparently said something unforgivable about the merits of unicorns versus dragons. Dragons are cooler, Lily was saying with the total conviction of an 8-year-old. Dad, don't you think dragons are cooler? Depends on the dragon, Caleb said, only half listening, his mind already 3 hours ahead in a warehouse he'd never seen. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got, Bug. At the house, he made dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup. Lily's favorite, the same thing he always made on Fridays, because it was easy, and she loved the ritual of dunking the sandwich until it nearly fell apart. And while she ate, he called Mrs. Dawson next door, a retired school teacher, who watched Lily most evenings. Caleb had to work late and asked if she could take Lily for a few hours that night. Everything all right, Caleb? Mrs. Dawson asked the question every neighbor eventually asked a single father, gentle but probing. Just some things I need to handle, Caleb said. Shouldn't be more than a couple hours. He didn't tell her where he was going. He didn't tell anyone except Ray the exact truth. Some part of him, the disciplined part, the part trained to compartmentalize to keep operational details need to know, simply defaulted to silence, even about something as small as a bare-knuckle bet at a warehouse. At 7:45, he dropped Lily at Mrs. Dawson's, hugged her twice, because once never felt like enough, told her he loved her more than dragons and unicorns combined, which made her laugh. And then he drove toward Route 9 with his hands steady on the wheel and something old and quiet waking up in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years, not since the day he hung up his uniform for the last time. The Iron Valley Warehouse sat at the edge of an old industrial lot, a rust-streaked building that had once housed a textile operation before the jobs left town for good, like they had in 100 towns just like Westbridge. Caleb could hear the noise before he even got out of his truck. A low roar of voices music, thumping through corrugated metal walls. The particular electric hum of a crowd that had gathered to watch something happen to somebody else. He parked at the edge of a gravel lot, already crowded with pickups and a few sports cars that looked wildly out of place among them, and he sat for a moment with his hands still on the wheel, breathing slow, the way he used to before every op 4 counts, in hold for 4 counts out. Not because he was afraid. Caleb Whitmore hadn't felt real fear in a long time, not the kind that mattered, not since Yemen. This was something else, a tightening, a recalibration, the part of him that had been dormant for 4 years stretching itself awake. He got out of the truck, shut the door, and walked toward the warehouse entrance, where a heavy-set man in a Carhartt jacket sat on a folding chair collecting $20 bills and waving people through a side door propped open with a cinder block. $20 if you're fighting, 10 if you're just watching, the man said without looking up. Caleb pulled 2 crumpled 10s from his jacket pocket. Fighting. The man glanced up then, taking in Caleb's flannel shirt. His work boots still faintly rimmed with grease. He hadn't fully scrubbed off the tired lines around his eyes. Something like pity flickered across his face. You sure about that man kid in there's undefeated? 22 and oh, he's not exactly gentle with volunteers. I'm sure, Caleb said. And something in his voice, flat calm, utterly without bravado, made the man pause for half a second before he shrugged and waved him through. Inside the warehouse opened into a cavernous space, lit by strings of work lights, hung from the rafters, casting everything in a harsh, yellow-white glow. In the center, a rough square had been marked off with orange tape, and a low wooden barrier, maybe 30 feet on each side, and around it, packed shoulder to shoulder, stood at least 200 people. Men, mostly a handful of women, beer cans and cash and phones held up, already recording the whole crowd buzzing with the particular hunger of people who'd come to see somebody get hurt for their entertainment. Caleb stood near the back for a moment, taking it in, doing what he'd always done in unfamiliar environments, assessing. Exits to the side door he'd come through, and a large rolling bay door on the far wall currently closed. Crowd density heavy near the ring, thinner toward the edges. Lighting adequate but uneven shadows pooling near the walls. He catalogued it all without consciously deciding to an old habit that had saved his life more times than he could count, now aimed at nothing more dangerous than a warehouse full of drunk townsfolk. And then he saw Brandon Keller. The young man stood inside the taped square, shirtless, his body a study in gym-sculpted muscle, a black belt, the literal item, not just the rank knotted around his waist over loose fight shorts. He was maybe 26, handsome in the way that came from good genetics and better self-regard, and he moved through a series of warm-up strikes with the loose, showy confidence of someone who'd never once doubted his own superiority. Every few seconds he glanced at the crowd, drinking in their attention like oxygen. All right, Brandon called out, raising both arms, and the crowd roared. Who's next? Who wants to try their luck against the champ tonight? A man near the front, young, drunk, encouraged by his friends, climbed over the barrier, and the crowd cheered louder. Brandon grinned and gestured him forward with both hands, a come-at-me motion that got another laugh. Caleb watched. He watched Brandon close the distance in half a second, watched a leg kick land clean against the volunteer's thigh with a sound like a bat hitting a side of beef. Watched the man crumple, watched Brandon step back and raise both arms again before the guy had even finished falling. 20 seconds, maybe less. The crowd loved it. They always loved it. That was the whole business model Caleb understood immediately. This wasn't really about fighting. It was about humiliation as entertainment, about a young man feeding an ego that clearly required regular feeding, about a town starved for spectacle, finding it in the cheapest, cruelest form available. Anybody else? Brandon called, spinning slowly, surveying the crowd like a king surveying subjects. $500. All you gotta do is last 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That's nothing. Come on, don't be shy. Nobody moved for a long moment, and then Ray, standing near Caleb, elbowed him gently. That's the deal, Ray murmured. Rough, though. You sure about this, man? Caleb didn't answer right away. He was still watching Brandon, still cataloging the young man's stance, slightly too wide, favoring his right leg for kicks, telegraphing his hip rotation a fraction of a second before every strike, a tell that would have gotten him killed in any real engagement, but had clearly never mattered against untrained volunteers. Yeah, Caleb said quietly. I'm sure. He stepped forward, unbuttoning his flannel shirt as he walked, revealing a plain gray t-shirt underneath the same clothes he'd worn to work that morning, grease stains and all. He climbed over the low barrier with the unhurried economy of movement of a much younger man, and the crowd's noise shifted, dipped into something quieter, more curious, as people took in the sight of him, a tired-looking man in his late 30s, unremarkable in every visible way, standing in the ring across from their undefeated champion. Brandon's eyebrows rose, and then he laughed, a short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. You gotta be kidding me. He looked past Caleb toward the crowd playing to them. You serious, old man? You here to fight, or you lost on your way to a Home Depot? Scattered laughter rippled through the warehouse. Caleb said nothing. He simply stood there, hands loose at his sides, feet shoulder-width apart, weight evenly distributed, a stance that looked to the untrained eye like nothing at all, like a man just standing around. To anyone who'd ever trained seriously, it would have looked like something else entirely: patient, balanced, ready. Nobody in that warehouse had ever trained seriously. Except Caleb. You get one warning, buddy, Brandon said, still grinning, stepping closer, close enough now that Caleb could smell the coconut scent of whatever product the kid used in his hair. Tap the mat, tap me, say uncle, whatever, I'll stop. I'm not trying to send anybody to the hospital. Usually. He grinned wider at that last word, playing to the crowd again, and got another laugh. Understood, Caleb said. His voice was quiet even. The first words he'd spoken since entering the ring, and something about their flatness. The complete absence of nerves of bravado of anything at all made Brandon's grin falter for just a fraction of a second. Just a flicker. Gone as fast as it came. But Caleb saw it. Caleb saw everything. A heavy-set referee in a black shirt, clearly just some local guy roped into the role, stepped between them, raised one hand, and glanced toward Ray, who was apparently running informal timekeeping on his phone. 3 minutes, the ref announced. Fighter goes down and can't continue or taps fight's over. Ready? Brandon nodded, bouncing lightly on his toes, already grinning at the crowd like the outcome was a foregone conclusion, already performing the victory he hadn't yet earned. Caleb said nothing. He simply nodded once. Fight. The crowd's roar crested as Brandon exploded forward fast, aggressive, a flurry of jabs meant to close distance and establish dominance in the opening seconds, the way he'd done against every volunteer before this one, the way that had worked every single time in 22 consecutive fights. Caleb didn't retreat. He didn't flinch. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, turned his shoulder a few degrees, and let the first jab pass 6 inches wide of his jaw, a distance so precise it looked almost accidental, though it was anything but. The second jab he deflected with the outside of his forearm, a small economical motion that cost him nothing, and told Brandon everything, though Brandon was moving too fast, too high on his own momentum to notice yet. The crowd's roar dipped into confused murmuring. This wasn't how it usually went. Usually the volunteer was already down by now, or backpedaling or covering up in a defensive crouch that Brandon would dismantle with contemptuous ease. Instead, the grease-stained mechanic was just standing there, moving just enough, not retreating an inch. "Come on, old man," Brandon called out, but there was an edge under the showmanship now, a note that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago. He threw a leg kick, his signature move, the one that had ended half his previous fights outright, a hard whipping strike aimed at the outside of Caleb's thigh. Caleb saw it coming a full half second before it launched exactly as he'd predicted from the tell in Brandon's hip rotation, and he simply lifted his knee, absorbing the kick against bone and muscle he'd conditioned for exactly this kind of impact over a decade of training that had never fully left his body. No matter how many years had passed since he'd used it seriously, Brandon's shin cracked against Caleb's raised knee with a sound that made several people in the front row wince, and Brandon himself let out an involuntary grunt of pain, hopping back half a step, shaking out his leg. The warehouse had gone almost silent now. "You all right?" Caleb asked. Just those 2 words. Quiet, almost gentle. And somehow in that silence, they carried further than any shout could have, and they landed on Brandon Keller like an insult far worse than anything the crowd had shouted at him in 22 fights combined. Because it wasn't gentle. It was contempt dressed as concern. And everybody in that warehouse, even the ones who hadn't followed a single sentence of technical fighting logic in the last minute, understood on some primal level that something had just shifted. Brandon's jaw tightened. The grin was gone now, replaced by something tighter, meaner. "Don't talk to me like I'm the one in trouble here." "Nobody's in trouble," Caleb said. "Yet." That last word did something to Brandon that the crowd's earlier laughter never could have. It got under his skin in a way he wasn't prepared for, wasn't equipped for, because Brandon Keller had spent his entire adult life being the most dangerous person in every room he walked into, and something about the mechanic's calm, the total absence of intimidation, the sense that this man had already decided how this would end and was simply waiting for Brandon to catch up, made him feel for the first time in longer than he could remember small. He attacked again, harder. This time, a combination. Jab, cross hook, all thrown with real speed, real training behind them, the kind of combination that had put 22 men on the ground before their 3 minutes were up. Caleb slipped the jab, rolled under the cross, and let the hook pass over his shoulder. As he pivoted a quarter turn, and for 1/2 second, Brandon's body was completely exposed. His balance thrown by his own momentum, his hands out of position, his entire left side open to anything Caleb wanted to throw. Caleb didn't throw anything. He simply stepped back and reset his stance. A gasp went through the crowd. not because they fully understood what they'd just witnessed, but because their bodies understood it, even when their minds hadn't caught up the primal recognition that they were watching a predator decline an easy kill, and that decision was somehow more unsettling than violence would have been. "Why didn't you hit me?" Brandon demanded, breathing harder now, sweat beading along his hairline despite the mild evening. "You're not ready yet," Caleb said. "Not ready for what?" Caleb didn't answer. He simply reset his stance again, patient waiting. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a voice. Ray's voice called out, "1 minute?" Brandon's face twisted. 1 minute gone, and the mechanic hadn't thrown a single strike, hadn't retreated a single step, hadn't shown a flicker of the fear that had defined every other man who'd stood across from him in this ring. Something in Brandon's chest was tightening now, a feeling he didn't have a name for, because he'd never needed one before the early unfamiliar shape of doubt. He attacked again, and this time there was less technique in it and more desperation. A wild flurry meant to overwhelm through sheer volume rather than skill. And for the first time, Caleb allowed himself to move with genuine speed, not to strike, not yet but to slip, weave, redirect each motion so economical, so unhurried, that it read almost as boredom to the untrained eyes, watching though anyone who'd ever studied real fighting would have recognized it instantly as mastery. A right hook grazed past Caleb's ear, close enough that he felt the wind of it, and something in his chest responded, not fear, but recognition. An old and familiar readiness surfacing from wherever he'd buried it 4 years ago. His body remembered. His hands remembered. Every hour of training in rooms that smelled like rubber mats and sweat and discipline, every hour of hand-to-hand combatives instruction that had once been the difference between coming home and not coming home. All of it was still there, waiting patient as he was. 30 seconds. Ray's voice again. Brandon's chest was heaving now. His punches had lost their crispness, his kicks, their snap. The crowd which had come to watch a slaughter had gone almost eerily quiet. 200 people collectively realizing they were witnessing something they didn't have the vocabulary for. Brandon threw one last desperate combination, a jab meant to set up a spinning back kick, a flashy high-risk move he'd landed exactly once in competition, and had been showing off in this ring for months, because it always got the crowd roaring. And as he spun, fully committing his weight, fully exposing his back for a fraction of a second, that would have ended any real engagement. In an instant, Caleb simply stepped to the side. Brandon's spinning kick found only air. His momentum carried him a half step too far. His balance tipped, and before he could fully recover, Caleb's hand closed around his extended wrist. Not violently, not with any strike behind it, just a firm, controlled grip that stopped Brandon's motion. Cold, and left him hunched off balance, breathing hard, effectively frozen in place in front of 200 people who had come expecting to watch him win. Time seemed to stretch. Caleb held the wrist for 1 second. 2. Long enough for every single person in that warehouse to understand exactly what had just happened. That the champion, the undefeated black belt, was standing there in a hold he could not break, put there without a single punch thrown against him. "Time!" Ray's voice rang out. 3 minutes. Caleb released Brandon's wrist immediately, stepping back, letting his hands drop to his sides. The warehouse erupted. Not in the roaring, bloodthirsty cheer they'd offered for 22 previous fights, but in something else, something closer to disbelief. A wave of murmurs and gasps, and a few scattered stunned claps that grew louder as the reality settled in. Brandon straightened slowly, chest heaving, staring at Caleb with an expression that had nothing left of the grin he'd worn 20 minutes ago. In its place was something raw: humiliation, confusion, and underneath both of those, a dawning, uncomfortable respect he didn't yet know how to hold. "Who are you?" Brandon asked, quiet enough that only Caleb, standing a few feet away, could hear it clearly over the crowd's noise. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. His breathing was even. His heart rate, had anyone checked it, would have barely registered above resting. He thought of Lily at Mrs. Dawson's house, probably watching cartoons right now, completely unaware that her father had just spent 3 minutes doing something he'd sworn to himself 4 years ago that he would never do again. "Nobody," Caleb said quietly. just a guy who needed $500. He turned and walked toward the edge of the ring, climbing back over the low barrier as the crowd parted around him, some reaching out to clap him on the shoulder, others simply staring. Phones still raised recordings that would end up online before the night was through. Recordings that would eventually find their way to people Caleb never intended to see them. The man in the Carhartt jacket met him near the exit with an envelope counting out $500 bills with visibly shaking hands. "Never seen anything like that," the man muttered. 22 fights, kid, never even got touched. You didn't even hit him." "Didn't need to," Caleb said, folding the money and tucking it into his jacket pocket. He walked out into the cool night air, and only once he reached his truck. Only once he was alone with the gravel crunching under his boots and the warehouse noise fading behind him. Did he let his shoulders drop? Did he let out a long breath? He felt like he'd been holding for years. Not just 3 minutes. Behind him, inside this warehouse, Brandon Keller stood in the center of the ring long after the crowd had begun to disperse, staring at the spot where the mechanic had been standing, replaying every second in his mind, searching for an explanation his ego could survive and finding none. He didn't know yet that within 48 hours, someone in that crowd, one of the young men filming on their phone, would recognize something in Caleb's stance, something in the disciplined economy of his movement, and would post the video with a caption asking if anyone recognized this dude's fighting style, and that the comments under that video would begin to fill slowly and then rapidly with speculation, and then with certainty, and then with a name that would travel through Westbridge like wildfire: Lieutenant Caleb Whitmore. Navy SEAL. He didn't know that his quiet, ordinary life, the one he'd built so carefully, so deliberately, brick by brick for the sake of an 8-year-old girl with mismatched socks, who believed her father hung. The moon was about to be cracked wide open in front of the entire town, whether he wanted it or not. He only knew as he drove home that night with $500 in his pocket and old dormant instincts humming quietly beneath his skin that he needed to stop by Mrs. Dawson's and pick up his daughter, and that tomorrow morning, before she even woke up, he was going to sign that field trip form and pay the $40 and make sure she never had a single reason to know how close things had come to falling apart. He didn't know that the truth was already loose in the world, spreading frame by frame through phone screens across town, and that there was no amount of quiet, no amount of grease under his fingernails that could put it back where it came from. By the time Caleb pulled into Mrs. Dawson's driveway, the shaking in his hands had finally stopped. He sat for a moment before getting out, running both palms over his jeans, forcing his breathing back into something ordinary, something a father should sound like when he knocked on a neighbor's door to collect his daughter on a Friday night. He caught his own reflection in the rearview mirror and almost didn't recognize the look in his eyes. Sharp alert, a version of himself he'd spent 4 years trying to bury under motor oil and quiet routine. Mrs. Dawson opened the door before he even knocked. Lily already bundled in her jacket backpack on, hopping from foot to foot with the restless energy of a kid who'd had too much lemonade and not enough bedtime. "She was a delight," Mrs. Dawson said, smiling. "Ate 3 cookies and told me an extremely detailed story about a classroom hamster. Sorry about the cookies, Bea. Don't be. That's what grandmothers are for, even the honorary kind." She studied him for a second, the way she always did, kind eyes that missed very little. "You all right, Caleb? You look a little worn." "Long day," he said. "Thank you for watching her." "Anytime." She crouched down to Lily's height. "You be good for your daddy, sweetheart." "I'm always good," Lily said with total confidence, and Mrs. Dawson laughed as Caleb took his daughter's hand and walked her to the truck. In the cab, Lily buckled herself in without being asked. She'd been doing that since she was 5, insisted on it, said she wanted to be a big girl, and immediately launched into an account of her evening that covered the hamster, a disagreement with Mrs. Dawson's cat, and a cookie recipe she wanted to try someday. Caleb listened, or made the sounds of listening, nodding at the right moments, while some other part of his mind replayed over and over the moment Brandon's spinning kick had found nothing but air. "Dad, are you even listening?" "Every word, Bug. What did I just say?" "Something about frosting," Lily huffed. I said Mrs. Dawson's cat doesn't like frosting. That's not the same thing. My mistake. He reached over without taking his eyes off the road and squeezed her small hand. I'm listening now. Promise. She seemed satisfied by that, launching back into her story with renewed enthusiasm. And Caleb let the sound of her voice fill the cab of the truck. Let it do the thing it always did, which was remind him why any of the rest of it, the money, the shop, the quiet nights spent staring at a ceiling, mattered at all. He didn't tell her where he'd been. He didn't tell her about the envelope of cash sitting in his jacket pocket, warm against his ribs like a small secret fire. As far as Lily Whitmore was concerned, her father had spent the evening handling boring grown-up business, the same as always, and tomorrow there would simply mysteriously be enough money for the field trip form the way there always mysteriously was, because that was the magic her father performed, quietly, invisibly, every single week of her life. She fell asleep in the 15 minutes it took to get home the way she always did on car rides. After a long day, her head tipped against the window, one dinosaur sock and one green sock hanging slightly off her small feet. Caleb carried her inside, laid her down, pulled the blanket up to her chin, and stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, watching her breathe. He thought about Brandon Keller's face in that final second. Not the anger, but what came after the anger. The confusion, the question that had come out almost like a plea. Who are you? Caleb didn't have an answer he was willing to give anyone. Not Brandon, not the crowd, not even most nights himself. He went to the kitchen, laid the $500 on the counter, and stared at it for a long time, before finally putting it in the drawer where he kept the household bills next to the transmission shop's invoice. Enough. Just enough. He allowed himself exactly 30 seconds of relief, and then he went to bed, and he did not sleep well. 2 towns over, in a cramped apartment above his uncle's gym. Brandon Keller sat on the edge of his bed at 11:30 that night, still in his fight shorts, staring at his own phone. The video was already up. Someone named Tyler Briggs, a kid Brandon barely knew, one of maybe 200 faces in that warehouse crowd, had posted a 50-second clip to a local sharing group, shaky handheld footage that captured most of the fight from an angle near the barrier. Brandon had watched it 4 times already, and each time the same feeling churned in his stomach, worse than any body shot he'd ever taken. The comments were the worst part. Who is this guy, Ilmeu? Bro got caught. Slipping, that mechanic ain't even breathing hard. Keller finally met his match, and it's a dude in a flannel shirt. This the most embarrassing thing I've seen all year, and I watched the Super Bowl. He should have turned the phone off. He knew he should have turned the phone off. Instead, he scrolled and scrolled, watching his own humiliation multiply in real time, watching strangers dissect the worst 3 minutes of his adult life with the casual cruelty of people who had never once stepped into a ring themselves. His uncle Frank Keller, who ran the gym downstairs and had trained Brandon since he was 9 years old, knocked once and let himself in without waiting for an answer the way he always did. You gonna tell me what happened, or am I finding out from the internet like everybody else in this county? Brandon didn't look up from the phone. Some mechanic, Ray Dobbins, brought him in. I don't know. That's not what I asked. Frank crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe, 61 years old, and built like a man who'd spent 4 decades in gyms and never softened an inch of it. I watched the clip, Brandon, 3 times. You want to tell me why a man twice your age just made you look like you never trained a day in your life? I don't know, Frank. The words came out louder than Brandon intended, sharp with a frustration that had been building for hours. He didn't even hit me, not once. I threw everything I had and he read me. Every single thing I did, he had an answer for it before I even finished the motion. Frank was quiet for a moment, studying his nephew's face with the particular scrutiny of a man who had trained 100 fighters and had learned over the years to see past their pride to whatever was actually happening underneath it. That's not a bad fighter beating you, Frank said finally. You know that, right? A bad fighter would have panicked. A bad fighter would have swung wild and gotten lucky or gotten caught. What you're describing, reading you staying calm, never wasting a movement, that's not somebody who dabbled in some boxing class at the Y. That's training. Real training. Years of it. Brandon finally looked up. You think he's some kind of pro, like undisclosed sandbagging me for the money? I think, Frank said slowly, that you need to find out exactly who that man is before you say another word about him online or off it, because whoever he is, he had you dead to rights tonight and chose not to finish it. That tells me something, and it should tell you something too. Tells me what? That he didn't need to prove anything, which means he already knows exactly what he's capable of. Frank shook his head. Guys like you and me, we fight because we're still trying to prove something to ourselves, to a crowd, whoever. A man who fights like that and doesn't even bother finishing it, that's a man who stopped needing to prove anything a long time ago. That's dangerous, Brandon. That's a different animal than anything you've faced in that ring. Brandon sat with that for a long moment, his uncle's words settling somewhere uncomfortable in his chest, and then he went back to his phone, this time typing a search instead of scrolling comments. Westbridge Mechanic Navy. Nothing useful came up. He tried Caleb Whitmore. A handful of results, a small auto repair shop's website with a bare-bones page, a 5-star Google review from someone thanking Caleb for an honest quote on brakework. Nothing that explained anything. He didn't sleep much that night either. By Saturday morning, the video had made its way through half of Westbridge. Caleb didn't know it yet. He woke before 6 as he always did, made coffee-packed Lily's lunch for the sleepover she had that afternoon with her friend Maya, and drove to the shop to open up, same as any other Saturday, the routine so ingrained, he could have done it half asleep, and mostly did. It was Ray who told him, showing up at the shop around 9 with 2 coffees and an expression Caleb had never seen on his friend's face before, something between awe and worry. You seen this yet? Ray held out his phone, the video already queued up. Caleb set down the wrench he'd been holding and took the phone. He watched the 50-second clip in silence, his own face unreadable, while Ray hovered nearby, watching him watch it. Ray? Yeah. How many people have seen this? I mean, it's a local group, so a few thousand, maybe more by now. It's been up since last night and it's still climbing. People are sharing it. Ray hesitated. Somebody in the comments is already asking if you're a fighter. Somebody else said you move like military. There's a guy I don't know him saying his cousin's in the reserves, and he thinks he recognizes the stance from combatives training. Caleb handed the phone back, his jaw tight. It's not a big deal. Caleb. Ray's voice dropped serious now. I've known you 4 years. You never talk about before you got here. Not once. Whatever this is, whatever you're not telling people, it's gonna come out now. That's just how this works. You can't put something like this back in the bottle. Caleb looked at his friend for a long moment, and something in his chest, the same tightness that had been building since the moment he stepped into that ring, settled into a kind of grim resignation. I know, he said quietly. He didn't elaborate, and Ray, to his credit, didn't push. But the rest of the morning passed differently than any Saturday before it. Customers who came in for oil changes lingered a little longer than usual, glancing at Caleb with a new kind of curiosity. Twice teenagers he didn't recognize peered through the shop's front window phones, raised before scurrying off when Caleb looked up. By noon, a man he'd never met walked in ostensibly to ask about a quote for a used car he was considering, and spent most of the conversation trying clumsily to work the fight into casual conversation. Crazy video going around, the man said, not quite meeting Caleb's eyes. That was you right out at Iron Valley. Just needed some quick cash, Caleb said, not looking up from the engine he was examining. Nothing more to it. Sure looked like more to it. My buddy says you move like special forces or something. Caleb straightened, met the man's eyes directly, his expression calm but final, in a way that closed the subject more effectively than any raised voice could have. I appreciate you bringing the car in. I can have that quote ready by Monday. The man got the message, nodded, made his exit, and Caleb stood alone in the shop for a moment. Afterward, hands on his hips, staring at nothing in particular, feeling the walls of the careful, quiet life he'd built over 4 years beginning to show their first cracks. Brandon showed up at the shop just after 4 that afternoon. Caleb heard the bell above the door and looked up from the paperwork he'd been half-heartedly attempting to focus on. And there he was. Brandon Keller, out of his fight gear, now wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, looking younger somehow than he had in the ring, and considerably less confident. For a moment, neither man said anything. "You lost," Caleb finally asked, setting down his pen. "No." Brandon shifted his weight, glanced around the shop. The tools, the half-disassembled engine on the lift, the faded photo taped to the wall near the register that showed Lily as a toddler, gap-toothed and grinning. "I wanted to. I came to talk, if that's all right." Caleb studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward a stool near the workbench. "Talk then. Talk." Brandon sat hands clasped between his knees, and for a moment he seemed to be searching for words that hadn't come easily to him in a long time. Words that weren't performance, weren't showmanship, weren't for a crowd. "I've been fighting since I was 9 years old," Brandon said finally. 22 straight wins in that ring. Never lost. Never even come close. And last night you didn't even hit me. You just stood there. Read every single thing I threw before I even finished throwing it. And I keep asking myself how, and I don't have an answer, and it's driving me insane." "Does it matter?" Caleb asked. "Yeah," Brandon said more sharply than he intended, and then softer. "Yeah, it matters, because I built my whole identity around being the best fighter anybody in this county's ever seen, and one night some mechanic in work boots proved that identity was mostly just nothing, just noise, just a crowd that never saw real skill before and didn't know the difference." Caleb leaned back against the workbench, arms crossed. Considering the young man in front of him, the raw, unguarded frustration on his face, so different from the arrogant showman who'd bounced around that ring the night before. "You want to know who I am?" Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, it doesn't matter who I am. What matters is what you do with what happened last night." Caleb's voice was quiet, but there was weight behind it, the particular weight of a man who had spent years training soldiers, briefing teams, correcting the mistakes of men whose lives depended on getting it right. "You've got real skill, Brandon. I saw that in the first 10 seconds. Fast hands, good footwork, decent instincts under pressure. That's not nothing. Most people who step in that ring don't have a fraction of what you've got." "Then why'd I lose?" "Because skill without discipline is just a show," Caleb said. "You fight for the crowd. You fight to be seen. Every strike you threw last night, some part of you was checking to see if people were watching, if they were impressed. That's a weakness, and it's one that any half-decent opponent will exploit every single time, because a man performing for an audience isn't fully present in the fight. He's split. Half of him's in the ring, half of him's watching himself fight from the outside." Brandon sat with that jaw working, something shifting behind his eyes. "How do you know that, about the being split or whatever?" Caleb didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "You ever been in a fight where losing meant somebody didn't go home, where there wasn't a crowd, wasn't a paycheck, wasn't anything on the other side, except whether you and the people counting on you made it through the next 10 minutes?" Brandon shook his head slowly. "Then you've never really been tested," Caleb said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. "You've been performing. That's different from fighting. Fighting is what happens when the performance stops mattering, and all that's left is whether you and the people you're responsible for survive the next few minutes. I hope you never have to learn the difference the hard way. But until you do, you'll keep losing to anybody who's actually been there, no matter how many trophies you collect against volunteers who never trained a day in their life." The shop was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the road, its engine noise rising and fading. Brandon stared at the concrete floor, and when he finally looked back up, something in his expression had changed. Not defeated exactly, but cracked open, in a way that let something more honest through. "I don't even know how to start fixing that," he admitted. "You start," Caleb said, "by asking yourself why you fight. If the honest answer is because I want people to be afraid of me, or because I want to feel powerful, then you're building on a foundation that's going to crumble the first time you meet somebody who doesn't care about any of that. But if you can find a reason underneath that something that isn't about the crowd, isn't about the ego, that's where real strength starts. Everything else is just noise. Brandon nodded slowly, absorbing it, and then, after a moment, he stood extending his hand. "Thank you," he said. Not for stopping when you could have finished it. I keep thinking about that. You had me. Completely. And you just stepped back." Caleb shook his hand a brief firm grip. "There was nothing left to prove. You already knew you'd lost. Finishing it would have just been for the crowd, and I told you that's the thing that got you into trouble in the first place." Brandon almost smiled at that, the irony of it landing somewhere honest in his chest. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "People are saying things. Online. About who you might be. Military stuff. You gonna address that or just let it keep spreading?" Caleb's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went distant for a moment, some calculation running that Brandon couldn't follow. "I'll handle it," Caleb said, though his voice carried less certainty than the words suggested. Brandon nodded once and left the bell above the door ringing behind him, and Caleb stood alone in the shop again, staring at the half-disassembled engine on the lift, without really seeing it, his mind already working through a problem that had no clean solution. A video was spreading through his town, a video that had already started peeling back 4 careful years of anonymity, and there was no wrench in his toolbox that could fix that kind of damage. That evening, after dropping Lily off at her sleepover, a whirlwind of excited hugs, and a hastily packed overnight bag containing, by Lily's careful count, exactly the right number of stuffed animals for a proper sleepover. Caleb drove home to an empty house for the first time in longer than he could remember, and the silence pressed on him differently than usual. He sat at the kitchen table with his phone scrolling through the video's comments, the way a man probes a bruise unable to stop himself, even though he knew it would only hurt more. The speculation had grown overnight, the way these things always did. Someone claiming to recognize combat stance, someone else insisting they'd seen similar footage of special forces training online, someone else entirely convinced Caleb must be a retired MMA fighter, using a fake identity to hustle small towns for easy money. None of them had the truth. Not yet. But they were circling it, closing in on it the way a search pattern eventually closes in on its target, and Caleb understood with the particular clarity of a man who had spent years anticipating threats before they materialized that it was only a matter of time. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Lieutenant Whitmore. This is Danny Ortiz's sister Maria. Someone sent me a video from a local Facebook group out of Westbridge, and I swear the man in it moves exactly like my brother used to describe when he talked about his LT. Is this really you? I've been trying to find you for years. I just wanted to say, Danny talked about you all the time before he died. Said you were the best officer he ever served under. I don't know if you even want to hear from me. I just needed to try." Caleb read the message 3 times, and something in his chest that had been braced, guarded, controlled for 4 straight years, finally gave way. Just slightly, just enough that he had to set the phone down on the table and press both palms flat against the wood, breathing through it, the way he'd once taught younger sailors to breathe through panic in confined, dangerous spaces. Danny Ortiz. 9 years gone. A face Caleb saw every morning in the 2 seconds after waking before the day's obligations crowded it out. He picked the phone back up, and his thumbs hovered over the screen for a long time before he finally typed a response, slow, deliberate, each word costing him something. "Yeah. It's me. I think about Danny every single day. I'm sorry it's taken this long for either of us to find the other. I'd like to talk if you're willing." He hit send before he could second-guess it, and then he set the phone face down on the table and sat there in the quiet of his kitchen. Alone, the past he'd spent 4 years trying to outrun finally catching up to him, not through choice, but through a 50-second video shot by a stranger's shaking hands in a warehouse he never should have walked into. Outside somewhere across town, the video kept spreading, kept multiplying, kept carrying his name, not the mechanic's name, not the name everyone in Westbridge thought they knew, but the other one, the real one, the one he'd buried along with 2 friends. He still spoke to quietly every morning before the sun came up toward a reckoning. Caleb wasn't sure he was ready for, even after everything he'd survived. He thought about Lily asleep now at her friend's house, blissfully unaware that her father's carefully built world was beginning to come apart at its seams. One shared video, one curious comment, one unexpected text message at a time. He thought about the promise he'd made her, that she would never carry the weight of things she didn't need to carry. And he understood with a dread that settled deep and cold in his stomach that keeping that promise was about to become far harder than it had ever been before. Because some secrets once loose in the world could not be called back, no matter how much a man wanted to protect the people he loved from the truth of who he used to be. And Caleb Whitmore was about to learn exactly how far that truth could travel once it started moving on its own. His phone buzzed again a few minutes later. Maria's reply came fast, like she'd been sitting there with the phone in her hand waiting. "I can't tell you what it means to hear from you. Danny used to write me letters, actual letters. Can you believe that in this day and age and half of every one of them was about you? He said you never left a man behind, not once, not in 11 years. He said the day you two pulled Marcus out of that building, you carried him almost a quarter-mile on your own back after you'd already taken shrapnel yourself. He never told our mother that part. He told me because he said someday she'd need to know the kind of man her son served under in case anything ever happened to him." I guess that day came sooner than either of us wanted. Caleb closed his eyes. The scar along his ribs had healed into a thin silver line years ago, but he could still feel the exact shape of that night whenever he pressed his fingers against it. In the shower, the weight of Marcus across his shoulders, the sound of Danny's voice behind him, calling out distances, corrections, warnings, the two of them working in a rhythm they'd built over years of training together, right up until the moment 3 weeks later, when that same rhythm hadn't been enough to bring Danny home. He typed back slowly. "He was the best man I ever served with. I think about him every single day. I'm sorry I never reached out sooner. I didn't know how to talk about any of it without it undoing me, and I had a daughter who needed a father who wasn't undone." "You don't have to explain that to me," Maria wrote back. "I just wanted you to know he loved you like a brother. And I'm glad you're still out there, still fighting for something, even if it's just a mechanic in some small town nobody's heard of. He'd be proud of that too. Maybe, especially that." Caleb set the phone down again, and this time he let himself sit with it. Really sit with it the way he rarely allowed himself to anymore. The grief arriving not as the sharp immediate agony of the first years, but as something quieter, older, worn smooth at the edges like Riverstone present, but survivable. He thought about calling Ray, decided against it. Thought about calling nobody at all, and finally just sat at his kitchen table in the dark. For a long while, phone screen dimming beside him, the house silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant occasional sound of a car passing on the road outside. Sunday morning brought a different kind of disruption. Caleb was in the shop early going through the week's invoices when his phone rang. Not a text this time, an actual call from a number he didn't recognize with an out-of-state area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. "Whitmore Auto." "Is this Caleb Whitmore, formerly Lieutenant Caleb Whitmore, U.S. Navy?" Caleb's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Who's asking?" "Sorry, my name's Derek Fallon. I'm a reporter freelance. I cover local interest stories that pick up traction online. Somebody sent me a video out of a town called Westbridge, showing a man matching your description, handling himself in a way that looks a whole lot like combatives training. A few people in a veterans forum I follow started putting pieces together, and your name came up. I wanted to reach out directly before running anything. Give you a chance to comment, confirm, or deny. I'm not interested in commenting on anything," Caleb said, keeping his voice level controlled. "I appreciate you calling instead of just running with speculation, but there's no story here. I'm a mechanic. That's it. With respect. Mr. Whitmore, the footage suggests otherwise, and my sources are telling me your service record, if it matches who I think it matches, is fairly remarkable. Multiple deployments, a citation that never got much public attention because of the classified nature of the operation." Caleb's stomach dropped. "Where are you getting that information?" "Public records mostly. Some of it took digging, but none of it's classified, not the parts I'm looking at. I just want to do right by the story, and by you, if you're willing to talk." A hometown hero angle single dad veteran humble mechanic. People eat this stuff up, and honestly in a good way. This could be a positive piece. I don't want a piece, Caleb said sharper now. Positive or otherwise. I have a daughter. I have a life here that I built specifically so nobody would look at us twice. I'd ask you respectfully to leave this alone. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Fallon spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, though it hadn't lost its professional persistence. I understand the instinct, I really do. But I'll be honest with you, the video's already out there. It's already spreading, and if I don't write the piece, somebody less careful will, somebody who might not extend you the same courtesy of a phone call first. Somebody who might dig into details you'd rather stayed buried. I'd rather you have some say in how this gets told. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, staring out the shop's front window at the empty street outside, weighing a decision he'd never wanted to have to make. I'll think about it, he finally said. That's all I can give you right now. That's fair. Take your time. Here's my direct line whenever you're ready. Fallon rattled off a number which Caleb didn't bother writing down, already knowing it would still be sitting in his call log if he needed it. He hung up and stood there for a long moment, phone still in his hand, feeling the walls of his careful life pressing in from every direction. At once, a reporter circling a grieving sister, reaching out a video multiplying by the hour, and somewhere beneath all of it, an 8-year-old girl who still believed her father was simply and only a tired man who fixed trucks for a living. He picked Lily up from her sleepover that afternoon, and she was full of stories about a movie she and Maya had watched about pancakes shaped like animals, about a disagreement over whether mermaids could technically also be pirates. And Caleb listened. Really listened this time, grateful for the distraction of her voice filling the cab of the truck, grateful for the reminder of exactly what all of this careful protection was for. "Dad, you're being quiet again," Lily said as they pulled into the driveway. "Just tired, bug." "Is it because of the money stuff? Is everything okay now?" Caleb turned off the engine and looked at her, this small, perceptive person who somehow always seemed to sense more than he wanted her to. "Everything's okay, I promise you. The field trip's covered. You don't need to worry about a single thing." "I wasn't worried about the field trip," Lily said with the particular bluntness of an 8-year-old, cutting straight through an adult's deflection. "I was worried about you." Something in Caleb's chest tightened at that, an ache that had nothing to do with money or reporters or grainy warehouse video. He reached over and pulled her into a hug across the truck's bench seat, holding her a beat longer than usual. "You don't need to worry about me either," he said into her hair. "That's my job, worrying about you, not the other way around." "Somebody's got to do it," she said, muffled against his shoulder, and despite everything pressing down on him, Caleb found himself laughing quiet and real for the first time in 2 days. That night, after Lily was asleep, Caleb sat on the back porch with a beer he didn't really want, listening to the crickets running through his options, the way he used to run through mission variables. Assess the threat, identify the exposure, contain what could be contained, accept what couldn't. The video wasn't going away. The reporter wasn't going away. Maria Ortiz had found him, and others who'd known Danny, known Marcus, known the man he used to be, might find him too. And some part of him, a part he'd kept locked away for 4 years, wondered if that was entirely a bad thing, or if some fraction of him had been waiting quietly for the world to catch up to the truth he'd been hiding. He didn't have an answer yet, but he understood, sitting there in the dark with the crickets and the cooling night air, that the quiet life he'd built for himself and his daughter had already changed, whether he was ready for it or not. And that Monday morning was going to bring more of it, whether he wanted it to or not. He finished the beer, went inside, checked on Lily one more time. Asleep, one arm flung over her stuffed rabbit, breathing slow and even, and went to bed. Himself, though sleep, once again came slowly and reluctantly, chased by faces he hadn't let himself think about in years. Danny's easy grin before a mission briefing. Marcus's weight across his shoulders in the dark, and now threaded through all of it a warehouse full of strangers' phones, raised to catch a moment Caleb had never intended for anyone to see. Monday morning arrived the way Caleb had known it would, louder than any Monday before it. He unlocked the shop at 7, same as always, flipped the sign to open. And by 7:15, there were already 3 trucks idling in the small gravel lot out front. None of them there for repairs. Men he recognized from around town. Men he'd nodded to 100 times at the hardware store or the gas station without ever exchanging more than a few words, now stood by their tailgates, trying to look casual. Phones tucked half visible in their hands, waiting for a glimpse of him. Caleb ignored them and got to work on the Silverado, still up on the lift from Friday, and for a while, the routine of it, the familiar weight of the wrench, the smell of oil, the particular satisfaction of a bolt finally breaking loose gave him something to hold on to. It didn't last. Around 9, his phone buzzed with a link. Ray again. "It's up." Fallon ran it anyway. Caleb wiped his hands and opened it standing in the doorway between the shop and the office, so he could still keep half an eye on Lily, who was at the kitchen table doing a word search before he dropped her at school, oblivious. The headline sat across the top of the article in bold black letters, "The Quiet Hero of Westbridge. How a small-town mechanic turned out to be a decorated Navy SEAL officer." Caleb's stomach tightened as he scrolled. Fallon had done his homework dates deployments. Even a blurred years-old photo Caleb didn't remember being taken of him in uniform, standing beside 2 other men whose faces the article mercifully hadn't named. The piece was careful, respectful, even framed exactly the way Fallon had promised hometown hero humble single father, quiet dignity, but none of that softened the blow of seeing his own life laid out in print for anyone in the country to read. The comments underneath were already climbing into the hundreds. "This is the kind of story America needs right now. A real hero, and nobody even knew. That's what true strength looks like. My dad served in the teams too. Thank you for your service, Lieutenant Whitmore. Somebody go buy this man's whole shop out, he deserves it." Caleb set the phone face down on the workbench and pressed both palms against his eyes for a long moment. "Dad?" Lily's voice came from the office doorway, small and uncertain. "Why do people keep looking at our shop?" He turned. She stood there in her school clothes backpack already on, staring past him through the front window at the men still loitering by their trucks, at a woman who'd just pulled up in a minivan and was now standing beside it with her phone raised. Caleb crossed the shop floor in 3 strides and crouched down in front of his daughter, taking both her hands in his. "Lily, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully, okay?" Her eyes went wide, the particular wide-eyed stillness she got when she sensed something serious was coming. "Okay. A long time ago, before you were born, before I even met your mom actually, I was in the Navy. I did a job that was very important and very dangerous, and it meant I couldn't always talk about what I did, even after I came home. When your mom and I had you, I decided I wanted to stop doing that job and just be your dad. That's all I ever wanted to be from the day you were born. Like a soldier." Lily's voice was hushed, uncertain, already trying to fit this new information into everything she thought she knew about her father. Something like that. A very specific kind. "It's why I know how to fix engines so well. And it's why a few nights ago I was able to win that fight I told you I needed to handle." He watched her face carefully, gauging how much of this she could hold. "Somebody made a video of it, and now people found out about the part of my life I used to keep private. That's why there are people outside right now. They're curious, that's all. It's not dangerous, and it doesn't change anything about us. I'm still your dad. I still make grilled cheese on Fridays. Nothing about our life is different." Lily was quiet for a long moment, processing, and then she asked with the devastating directness only an 8-year-old could manage. "Were you scared when you did the soldier job?" Caleb thought about it honestly, the way he always tried to answer her, even when honesty was harder than a comforting lie. "Sometimes, yeah. But I had really good people with me, and we took care of each other. That's what made it possible to be brave, even when we were scared. Like Danny and Marcus." She'd overheard those names somewhere, probably his sleep-talking or a phone call she wasn't meant to catch. And Caleb felt something crack quietly in his chest at hearing them in her small, curious voice. "Yeah, Bug. Like Danny and Marcus. Are they gonna come visit sometime? I'd like to meet them." Caleb's throat tightened, and for a moment he couldn't find words at all. He pulled her into a hug instead, holding her against his chest, breathing through the ache that question had opened in him. "They're not able to visit anymore," he said finally quietly. "They died a long time ago doing that same important job. But I think about them every single day, and I think they'd have loved meeting you more than almost anything in the world." Lily pulled back slightly, studying his face with a seriousness that made her look for just a moment much older than 8. "That's why you get sad sometimes, in the mornings. I've seen you." Caleb hadn't realized she'd noticed. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, that's why." "I'm sorry, Dad." She hugged him again, small arms wrapping as far around him as they could reach. "I didn't know. I would have hugged you more if I knew." "You hug me plenty," he said, voice rough. "More than plenty. You're the reason any of the sad mornings turn into good days. You know that." She nodded against his shoulder, and they stayed like that for a long moment, the shop quiet around them, except for the distant murmur of the small crowd still gathered outside, curious and well-meaning, and utterly oblivious to the conversation happening just beyond the glass. He drove her to school himself that morning, instead of letting her take the bus, unwilling to have her walk out to the bus stop past whatever attention might still be lingering around the house. And as they pulled up to the elementary school's drop-off line, Lily turned to him with a question that had clearly been building the whole ride. "Dad, are the kids going to know about the soldier thing?" "Maybe some of them," Caleb admitted. "Their parents might have seen it online, but it's nothing to be embarrassed about, Lily. If anything—" "I'm not embarrassed," she interrupted, indignant. "I'm going to tell everybody my dad's a superhero, and if anybody says anything mean, I'm going to tell them their dad probably can't even change a tire." Despite everything weighing on him, Caleb laughed a real full laugh, the first one in days. "That's not exactly the message I was going for, but I appreciate the loyalty." "I'm serious," Lily said, already unbuckling backpack in hand, entirely recovered from the morning's heavy conversation with the resilient speed that only children seem to possess. "You're the coolest dad in this whole school, and now everybody's going to know it." She kissed his cheek, hopped out, and disappeared into the flow of kids heading toward the entrance. And Caleb sat in the truck for a moment longer, watching her go, something warm, cutting through the tension that had been sitting in his chest all morning. He drove back to the shop, and the crowd outside had thinned somewhat, though a few stragglers remained, and among them, standing slightly apart from the others, near the edge of the lot, was Brandon Keller. Caleb parked and got out, and Brandon crossed the gravel to meet him halfway. "I read the article," Brandon said without preamble. "Whole town's talking about it. I figured you might want to know some of the guys who watched me lose to you Friday night are saying things. Not bad things. Just, it's changed how people look at what happened. Nobody's laughing at me for losing to some random mechanic anymore. Now they're saying I lasted 3 whole minutes against a decorated combat veteran, which apparently makes me look better, not worse." He shook his head, something wry in his expression. "Funny how that works. How are you handling it?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious. "Better than I expected. My uncle keeps telling me it's the best thing that could have happened to me, took the wind out of my ego right when I needed it, and now I've got a story that actually makes me sound decent instead of just cocky." Brandon paused, glancing toward the shop, toward the last of the lingering onlookers. "I actually came by for something else, though. I wanted to offer to help. If people are going to keep showing up here bothering you, I've got some friends who could stand around, make it clear you're not doing meet and greets. Free of charge. Feels like the least I can do." Caleb studied the young man for a moment, surprised by the offer. Surprised more by the sincerity behind it. "I appreciate that," he said. "But I think this dies down on its own in a week or two. Small towns move on fast once the next thing comes along. Maybe." Brandon didn't look entirely convinced. "For what it's worth, I've been thinking about what you said, about fighting for the crowd instead of fighting for something real. I called my uncle's old training partner yesterday. Guy runs a program that works with actual veterans, teaches real self-defense, not the flashy stuff. Asked if I could volunteer help out, learn something that isn't about looking good for an audience." He shrugged, a little self-conscious. Figured you'd get a kick out of that. Something eased in Caleb's chest, a small, genuine warmth cutting through the exhaustion of the morning. That's a good move, Brandon. I mean that. Yeah, well. Brandon extended his hand again, and Caleb shook it. Guess I owe you for that, on top of the humiliation. Consider us even, Caleb said, and for the first time since Friday night, something in the exchange felt lighter, easier, less like the fallout of a mistake, and more like the unexpected beginning of something worthwhile.
Geta Meg.
The reporter called again that afternoon, and this time, Caleb answered without hesitation, some of his earlier resistance worn down by the day's events, by Lily's fierce, uncomplicated pride, by Brandon's unexpected sincerity. I saw the piece, Caleb said. You were fair. I appreciate that more than I probably let on this weekend. I tried to be, Fallon said. For what it's worth, the response has been overwhelmingly positive. People are sharing it because it's the kind of story that reminds them there's still good, quiet decency out there, even in a world that mostly rewards the loud stuff. I don't know if that helps given everything, but I wanted you to hear it. It helps some, Caleb admitted. Doesn't change that my daughter had to learn things about her father faster than I ever wanted her to. But I understand you didn't create that situation. I did the second I walked into that warehouse. For an easy $500, Fallon said, and Caleb could hear something like a smile in his voice. Turned out to be a lot less easy than advertised, Caleb said dryly, and Fallon laughed. One more thing and then I'll leave you alone, Fallon said. A few veterans organizations have reached out to me since the piece ran, asking if you'd be open to speaking with them. Nothing about publicity they're more interested in, whether you'd consider mentoring or getting involved with programs for guys transitioning out of service, guys who might be struggling the way it sounds like you struggled when you first got out. No pressure. Just wanted to pass it along. Caleb was quiet for a moment, considering it something in the offer landing differently than he expected, not as an intrusion, but as a door he hadn't realized he wanted opened. Send me the information, he said finally. I'll think about it. That's the most I can promise right now. That's more than fair, Fallon said. Take care of yourself, Lieutenant, and that daughter of yours. Sounds like she's got quite the father. They hung up and Caleb stood in the quiet of the shop for a long moment. The afternoon light slanting low through the front windows, dust motes drifting through it, and he found himself thinking for the first time in years that maybe the wall he'd built around his old life hadn't been protecting Lily, so much as it had been protecting himself, and that maybe 4 years later, he was finally strong enough to let a little of it down. That evening, after picking Lily up from school, where true to her word, she'd apparently informed at least 6 classmates and one very patient teacher that her father was in fact a superhero. Caleb sat with her at the kitchen table while she worked through math homework, and his phone buzzed one more time. Maria Ortiz again. I hope this isn't overstepping, but I wanted to ask, would it be all right if I visited sometime? I've got some of Danny's things I think you should have. His letters mention you so much, I feel like I already know you, and I'd love for my kids to meet the man their uncle looked up to more than anybody. Caleb read the message twice, glanced up at Lily bent over her homework with her tongue poking slightly out of the corner of her mouth in concentration. The same way she'd done it since she was 4 years old, and something settled in him. Not resolution exactly. Not yet. But the first real sense that the life he'd built here, the one that had just cracked wide open in front of the entire town, might not be broken after all. Just larger than it had been. Larger, and maybe finally more honest. I'd like that, he typed back. Lily would like meeting you too. It's about time she knew more about where she comes from. He set the phone down and watched his daughter work through a column of subtraction problems, humming quietly to herself, utterly unaware of how much had shifted in the world around her. In the span of one weekend, unaware that her father, quiet, careful, endlessly protective, Caleb Whitmore, had spent the better part of 4 years guarding a version of himself he was only now slowly beginning to let breathe again. Dad is 9 minus 4, 5 or 6. 5, he said, smiling. Count it out on your fingers if you're not sure. She did, moving her lips silently, and confirmed it with a satisfied nod before moving on to the next problem, and Caleb sat there watching her grateful, in a way that went deeper than words for every single ordinary moment that this strange, disruptive, unexpected weekend hadn't managed to take from either of them. Wednesday brought a visitor Caleb hadn't expected, though. In hindsight, he probably should have. He was under the hood of a minivan when the bell above the shop door rang, and he looked up to see a man in his 60s standing just inside the entrance. Weathered hands, a faded ball cap with a Navy insignia stitched into the front, and an expression that carried the particular gravity of somebody who'd come with more than just car trouble on his mind. "You Whitmore?" the man asked. "That's me." Caleb wiped his hands on a rag and straightened. "Something I can help you with." "Name's Walt Pruitt. Served 26 years Army, not Navy, so don't hold that against me." A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "Read that article about you Sunday? Couldn't stop thinking about it since." Caleb set the rag down slowly, sensing this wasn't a conversation about a transmission. "Appreciate you coming by, Walt. What's on your mind?" Walt shifted his weight, glanced around the shop, as though gathering courage from the ordinary machinery surrounding him. "Got a grandson, 24 years old. 2 tours overseas, came home about 18 months back, and he's—" Walt's jaw worked for a moment before he continued. "He's not doing good, Caleb. Doesn't leave the house much. Doesn't talk about what happened over there. His mother's at her wit's end, and I don't know how to reach him anymore. I served my time, but it was different decades ago. Different kind of war. I don't have the words he needs to hear." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, recognition of a particular kind of pain he understood better than almost anyone in this town could. "I'm not a counselor, Walt. I want to be honest with you about that. I know that. I'm not asking you to fix him. I'm asking if you'd be willing to just talk to him. Sit with him a while. Somebody who's actually been where he's been doing the kind of work he did. He won't talk to me. Won't talk to the VA counselor they set him up with. Not really, not honestly. But maybe somebody who's walked the same road might get through where the rest of us haven't." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Walt seemed prepared to be turned away, already halfway to an apology for asking when Caleb spoke. "What's his name?" "Tommy. Thomas Pruitt." "Give me his number," Caleb said. "I can't promise anything, Walt. I'm not trained for this the way a counselor is. But I know what it's like to come home and not know how to fit back into a life that used to feel normal. If talking to somebody who's been there might help even a little, I'm willing to try." Walt's shoulders dropped with visible relief, and he pulled a folded scrap of paper from his jacket pocket, already prepared with a phone number written in careful, deliberate handwriting, as though he'd been carrying it for days, waiting for the courage to hand it over. "Thank you," Walt said, voice rough. "You don't know what this means. To his mother, to me." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said. "Thank me if it actually helps." Walt nodded, shook Caleb's hand with a grip stronger than his age suggested, and left, and Caleb stood there afterward, holding the small scrap of paper, staring at the name written on it, feeling the shape of something new settling into the life he'd so carefully rebuilt. Not a burden exactly, but a responsibility he hadn't expected to carry and wasn't entirely sure yet how to hold. He called Tommy Pruitt that night after Lily was asleep, sitting alone at his kitchen table with the number Walt had given him. The young man's voice on the other end was guarded, clipped, clearly braced for another well-meaning stranger trying to fix something he didn't believe could be fixed. "My grandfather send you?" "He did. Told me you might not want to hear from me, and that's fair. I'm not calling to lecture you or tell you what you should be feeling. I'm calling because I spent a long time after I got out not knowing how to talk to anybody about what I'd seen, what I'd done, what I'd lost. Took me longer than it should have to figure out that carrying it alone wasn't strength. It was just slow suffocation." There was a long silence on the line, long enough that Caleb wondered if Tommy had hung up. "2 tours," Tommy finally said, voice low. "Lost 3 guys in my unit. People keep telling me I should be grateful I made it home. Like that's supposed to make the rest of it easier." "It doesn't," Caleb said simply. "Gratitude and grief aren't opposites. You can carry both at the same time, and most of us who made it back do, whether we admit it or not." Another silence, softer this time, less defensive. "You really a SEAL? Grandpa said you did some crazy stuff, some article online. I did some things, Caleb said. Doesn't make me special Tommy. Just means I've got scars in places people can't see same as you. Difference is, I've had 4 more years than you to figure out how to live alongside them instead of underneath them. Doesn't mean I've got it all figured out. Some days I still don't. But I'm willing to talk through what I have learned if you're willing to listen. They talked for nearly an hour that night, haltingly at first, then with more ease as Tommy's guarded, clipped sentences gradually gave way to something closer to real conversation. And by the time Caleb finally hung up, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel that week. A sense that the video, the article, the crowd outside his shop, all of it disruptive and unwelcome as it had been, had also cracked open a door he might never have walked through. Otherwise, a door leading not backward into old danger, but forward into a kind of purpose he hadn't realized he was missing. Thursday afternoon. Brandon showed up at the shop again, this time with a folder tucked under one arm, and something about the set of his shoulders told Caleb this visit carried more weight than the last one. Got a proposal, Brandon said, setting the folder on the workbench. Been thinking about what you said about fighting for the crowd, instead of fighting for something real. Talk to my uncle. Talk to the guy who runs that Veterans Self-Defense program. We want to put together something different. Free classes twice a month for guys coming back from deployment, guys struggling with the same stuff Tommy Pruitt's been struggling with. Not flashy, not for an audience. Just real training, real discipline taught by people who actually understand what these guys are carrying. Caleb opened the folder, scanning the rough outline. Brandon had sketched a schedule, a proposed curriculum focused as much on breathing and grounding as on technique. A short paragraph at the top that read, almost like an apology, and a mission statement rolled into one. You wrote this? Caleb asked. Some of it. My uncle helped with the technical stuff. Brandon shifted his weight, uncharacteristically nervous. I want you involved. Not as some kind of trophy. I know how that would look, dragging out the local hero to legitimize things. I mean actually involved. Teaching, if you're willing. I think guys like Tommy would listen to somebody who's actually been where they've been way more than they'd listen to somebody like me who spent his whole life training for an audience instead of for anything that mattered. Caleb studied the folder for a long moment, then looked up at Brandon, seeing in the young man's face a sincerity that hadn't been there the week before, a hunger for something more substantial than trophies and crowd noise. I'll do it, Caleb said. On one condition. Name it. No filming, no social media posts about it. Whatever these guys share in that room stays in that room. This isn't content, Brandon. It's real. Understood. Brandon said immediately, extending his hand, and Caleb shook it, feeling something settle into place that felt less like an ending and more like an actual beginning. Not the closing of the door he'd kept shut for 4 years, but a careful, deliberate opening of it on his own terms, for a purpose he could finally see clearly. That evening, Caleb told Lily about the program over dinner, watching her face light up the way it always did when something involved her father doing something she considered heroic. So you're gonna teach people to be brave? She asked around a mouthful of grilled cheese. Something like that. Teach them how to carry hard things without letting the hard things carry them instead. That's what you do for me, Lily said matter-of-factly, dunking her sandwich into her tomato soup with total focus. Every time I'm scared about something, you help me carry it, like when I was scared about the dentist, or when Mom... She paused the way she sometimes did when her mother came up, testing the weight of the subject before continuing. When Mom died, and I didn't understand why. You helped me carry that too. Caleb reached across the table and squeezed her small hand throat tight. That's the most important job I've ever had, Bug. More important than anything I did before you were born, and more important than anything I'll do with those veterans now. You come first. Always. I know, Lily said, entirely unbothered, already moving on to describing in exhaustive detail a classmate's opinion about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. And Caleb sat there listening, grateful, steadier than he'd felt in years. Watching his daughter navigate the ordinary chaos of being 8 years old, blissfully unaware of how much her father had rebuilt himself in the span of one strange, disruptive week, Not by hiding from his past, as he'd tried to do for 4 careful years, but by finally letting it stand beside the life he'd built since, instead of burying it beneath the weight of everything that came after. Saturday morning. Tommy Pruitt showed up at the shop unannounced, standing awkwardly by the front door, the way Walt had a few days earlier, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, eyes not quite meeting Caleb's. "Didn't know if you'd remember me," Tommy said. "The phone call. Wednesday." "Course I remember," Caleb said, setting down his tools. "Good to put a face to the voice. How you holding up? Better maybe." "Grandpa mentioned some program you're starting with that guy who fought you. Wanted to see if it was real, or if it was just talk." "It's real," Caleb said. "First session's in 2 weeks. You're welcome to come, no pressure, no obligation. Just show up if you want to leave if it's not for you." Tommy nodded slowly, still not quite meeting Caleb's eyes, but something in his posture had loosened slightly since the phone call, a fraction of the guardedness worn away. "Grandpa cried," Tommy said abruptly. "After you called me Wednesday. First time I've seen him cry since Grandma passed. Said he hadn't seen me talk that long that easy in over a year." He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the admission. "Wanted to thank you for that. Even if the program doesn't end up being my thing. That phone call mattered." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. The particular ache of purpose finally finding its shape after years of searching for it in the wrong places, in silence, in solitude, in the careful architecture of a life built to keep everyone, even himself, at arm's length from the truth of who he used to be. "You don't owe me any thanks, Tommy, but I'm glad it helped. That's all I was hoping for." 2 weeks then, Tommy said, and for the first time since he'd walked in, something like the ghost of a smile crossed his face. "I'll be there." He left, and Caleb stood in the doorway of his shop for a long moment, watching Tommy's truck pull out of the gravel lot, feeling the particular hard-won satisfaction of watching someone take one small difficult step toward the light. That night, after Lily was asleep, Caleb sat on the back porch again, beer in hand, and allowed himself for the first time in 4 years to think honestly about the shape of the life ahead of him. Not the quiet, guarded existence he'd built out of necessity after Sarah's death, but something larger, more honest, carrying both the mechanic he'd become and the officer he'd once been side by side, instead of one hidden beneath the other. He thought about Danny, about Marcus, about the promise he'd made himself the day he held Lily for the first time that he would be present, ordinary, alive for her, no matter what it cost him. He understood now, sitting in the dark with the crickets singing around him, that being present didn't mean erasing everything that came before. It meant carrying all of it, the mechanic and the officer, the grief and the gratitude, and choosing every single day to keep showing up anyway for Lily, for Tommy, for whoever else might need somebody who understood exactly how heavy the weight of survival could be, and exactly how much lighter it became once you stopped trying to carry it alone. The crowd outside the shop had thinned to nothing by the following week. The article's traffic slowed, as these things always did, the town's attention already drifting toward the next piece of local gossip. But something had changed permanently in how Westbridge looked at Caleb Whitmore, something that no amount of time would fully undo, and somewhere in that change, in the space between the man everyone had underestimated and the man the town now saw clearly, for the first time, Caleb found himself standing on ground that felt, against every instinct he'd carried for 4 careful years, a little more solid than before, a little less alone, carrying not just the weight of his own past, but the beginning of something that might in time help carry other men through theirs. Maria Ortiz arrived on a Saturday 2 weeks later, pulling into Caleb's driveway in a minivan, packed with 2 kids in the back seat and a cardboard box on the passenger seat that she carried into the house like it weighed considerably more than its size suggested. Caleb met her at the door, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, just stood there taking each other in. Maria, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with Danny's same easy set to her jaw that Caleb recognized instantly, even though he'd never met her in person. And Caleb, older than she'd pictured from her brother's letters. Quieter, but with something steady in his eyes that matched exactly what Danny had always described. "You look like him," Caleb finally said. "Around the eyes." "Everybody says that." Maria's voice caught slightly. "I used to hate hearing it. Now I kind of love it." She stepped forward and hugged him. Unexpected fierce, and Caleb, who hadn't been embraced by anyone outside his daughter in longer than he could remember, stood there for a moment before finally returning it, feeling something in his chest loosen that had been clenched tight for 9 years. "These are my kids," Maria said, pulling back, wiping quickly at her eyes before turning toward the minivan. "Sophia Marcus." "Marcus." Caleb's breath caught. "After your Marcus," Maria confirmed quietly. "Danny asked me to if I ever had a boy. Made me promise actually about a year before he died. Said if anything ever happened to either of them, he wanted somebody carrying that name forward who'd never have to know what it cost to earn it." Caleb stood there in his own driveway, looking at a 7-year-old boy climbing out of a minivan, entirely unaware that he carried the name of a man who had died pulling his own body weight in dirt and fire on the other side of the world. And something in Caleb broke open quietly, privately, in a way he hadn't allowed in years. Lily came bounding out of the house at that moment, curious about the commotion, and stopped short at the sight of the other kids, suddenly shy in the particular way she got around unfamiliar children. "Lily, this is Maria," Caleb said, steadying his voice. "She's Danny's sister. Remember I told you about Danny?" Lily's eyes went wide with recognition. The one who died being brave. Maria's breath caught audibly, and she crouched down to Lily's height, studying the little girl's face with something like wonder. "That's exactly right," Maria said softly. "He was very, very brave. And I bet your dad's told you he was funny too. Made everybody laugh even in the hardest moments." "Dad doesn't laugh a lot," Lily said matter of fact. "But when he talks about Danny, sometimes he smiles a little. I've seen it." Caleb felt his throat tighten, and Maria looked up at him, something understanding passing between them, two people bound together by grief neither had chosen, and a man neither of them would ever stop missing. "Well," Maria said, straightening, gesturing toward her own kids. "This is Sophia, she's 10, and this troublemaker is Marcus. He's 7, and he's already decided he wants to be a Navy pilot, which terrifies me on a weekly basis." "I want to fly jets," Marcus announced immediately, entirely unprompted, with the total confidence of a 7-year-old who had never once doubted his future plans. "Real fast ones. Lily's dad flew helicopters sometimes," Maria offered, glancing at Caleb for confirmation, and Caleb nodded, and just like that, Marcus's whole face lit up, and within 30 seconds, he was peppering Caleb with questions about aircraft that Caleb answered patiently, carefully, editing out anything too heavy for a 7-year-old's curiosity while still giving him something real to hold on to. They spent the afternoon on Caleb's back porch, the kids running around the yard while the adults talked, and Maria opened the cardboard box she'd carried in, revealing a stack of letters tied with string, a folded flag, and a small collection of photographs. Caleb had never seen Danny at basic training. Danny at his and Maria's mother's 60th birthday. Danny grinning in a photo booth with an arm slung around a girl Caleb vaguely remembered him mentioning once years ago during a long night on watch when the two of them had traded stories to keep from thinking about anything else. "I want you to have some of these," Maria said. "Not all of it. Mom needs to keep most of it, obviously. But I made copies of the letters that mention you specifically. I thought Lily might want to read them someday when she's older. Understand who her dad served with. What kind of man he was." Caleb held the small stack of photocopied letters in his hands, feeling their weight far exceed their size. And for a long moment he couldn't speak. "Thank you," he finally managed. "This means more than I know how to say." "He'd have wanted you to have it," Maria said simply. "He talked about you like you were the standard everybody else got measured against. I think some part of him knew even before it happened that if anything went wrong, he wanted you to have something to hold on to besides the guilt. He knew you'd carry guilt. He told me that once, actually, in one of the letters, said if he didn't make it back, he didn't want you blaming yourself, and he wanted somebody to make sure you heard that eventually, whenever you were ready." Caleb sat with that for a long moment, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the porch. the sound of 3 kids laughing somewhere in the yard, and something in him that had been braced against exactly this kind of forgiveness for 9 straight years finally quietly let go. "I've carried it every day," he admitted, voice rough. "Every single day since it happened." "I know," Maria said gently. "But maybe now you don't have to carry it alone anymore." The first session of the Veterans Program ran on a Wednesday evening 2 weeks after Maria's visit, held in the same gym above Frank Keller's boxing club, where Brandon had spent his whole life training to be somebody the crowd would cheer for. Caleb arrived early, helping Brandon and Frank set up mats along the far wall, and by 7 o'clock, 8 men had trickled in, some older, weathered, carrying the particular stillness of veterans who'd spent decades learning to hold their pain silently. Others younger, more visibly restless, unable to sit still, unable to meet each other's eyes. Tommy Pruitt was among them, arriving last, hovering near the door for a long moment, before finally stepping fully inside. Caleb didn't start with technique. He started instead by sitting down cross-legged on the mat, and waiting until the room settled into an uncertain, watchful quiet. "I'm not going to pretend I've got this all figured out," Caleb said. "Some of you probably read that article know a little about what I used to do. That doesn't make me an expert on what you're carrying. Every one of us in this room carries something different. But I know what it's like to come home and not know how to fit the person you used to be into the life you're supposed to be living now. I know what it's like to think the only way to survive that is by staying quiet, staying alone, never letting anybody close enough to see the parts of you that got left behind over there." A few of the men shifted uncomfortable recognition, flickering across faces that had clearly spent a long time avoiding exactly this kind of conversation. "I spent 4 years thinking silence was strength," Caleb continued. "Turns out it's just a slower way of drowning. I'm not up here to tell you how to fix yourselves. I'm here because I think training your body, real training, disciplined training, not performance, not ego, can help you find your way back into your own skin. And because sometimes being in a room with other people who understand exactly what you're carrying, without having to explain a single word of it, does more good than any amount of talking ever could." He looked around the room, meeting eyes where they were offered, letting the silence hold where men weren't ready yet. "We're going to work through some basic drills tonight. Breathing, grounding movement. Nothing flashy. If at any point you need to step out, step out. Nobody's going to think less of you. This isn't a performance. There's no crowd here to impress." Tommy, sitting near the back, spoke up for the first time, voice quiet, but steady. "What if we're not ready to talk about any of it? Just the training part. Is that enough?" "That's more than enough," Caleb said. "Some nights showing up is the whole victory. Nobody's required to talk about anything they're not ready for." Something in Tommy's shoulders eased slightly at that, and over the next hour, Caleb led the group through a series of slow, deliberate drills, breathing exercises, borrowed from his own years of training. Grounding techniques he'd once used before, missions to steady a racing heart. Basic defensive movements executed with a patience and care he'd never once shown Brandon in that warehouse ring, because this wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about giving these men something solid to stand on. By the end of the session, something had visibly shifted in the room, not dramatically, not in a way that made for good footage or a viral video, but quietly in the loosened shoulders. The slightly steadier breathing, the handful of tentative conversations that sparked between men who'd arrived as strangers and left, if not as friends yet, then at least as something closer to it. Tommy lingered after the others had filtered out, helping Caleb fold up the mats. "Same time next month?" Tommy asked. "Same time," Caleb confirmed. "You planning on coming back?" Tommy considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider everything, weighing it with a caution Caleb recognized from his own early years of learning to trust anything again. "Yeah," Tommy said finally. "I think I am." Word of the program spread slowly through the surrounding towns over the following weeks. Not through any social media campaign, Caleb had been firm about that, but through the quiet, reliable channel of veterans, talking to other veterans, fathers mentioning it to sons, 5, counselors passing the information along to patients they thought might benefit. By the third session, the group had grown to 14 men, and Frank Keller had started clearing his gym's schedule around it without being asked, understanding, in the way old trainers often understood things before anyone had to explain them, that something more important than typical gym business was happening in that room on Wednesday nights. Brandon showed up to every session, not as an instructor. He was careful about that boundary, deferring entirely to Caleb and to the older veterans who occasionally offered their own guidance, but as a quiet presence at the edges, setting up mats, handing out water, absorbing lessons about discipline and humility that no amount of trophies had ever taught him. "You ever think," Brandon asked one evening after the group had cleared out and the two of them were stacking equipment, "that none of this happens if I don't bet you $500 that Friday night?" "Crossed my mind," Caleb admitted. "Feels like it should bother me more than it does," Brandon said. "Getting embarrassed in front of half the county, having my whole identity picked apart online. But honestly, best thing that ever happened to me. I was so busy trying to be somebody people were scared of, I never stopped to think about what I actually wanted to build." "Most people don't stop to think about that until something forces them to," Caleb said. "Doesn't make the forcing painless, but it's usually necessary." Brandon nodded slowly, considering that, and then glanced toward Caleb with something like genuine curiosity. "You ever regret it? Walking into that warehouse that night?" Caleb thought about it honestly before answering, thought about the reporter's calls, the crowd outside his shop, the conversation he'd had to have with Lily far earlier than he'd ever wanted, to the exposure of a life he'd spent 4 careful years protecting. "Some parts of it, yeah," Caleb admitted. "Wish it hadn't cost my daughter a piece of her childhood innocence a little sooner than I wanted. But I don't regret walking in. I needed that money for her, and I got it. Everything else that came after the article, this program, reconnecting with people from my old life, I'd lost touch with. None of that would have happened if I hadn't." Sometimes the things that scare us most end up being the things that push us toward exactly where we needed to end up. "Your daughter doing okay with all of it?" Brandon asked. "The attention, I mean." Caleb's expression softened, something warm cutting through the weight of the conversation. "Better than okay. Told half her class I'm a superhero. Started asking me questions about the Navy every night at dinner, wants to know everything, wants to meet more of the people I served with. I think in a strange way it's brought us closer. She used to just know I was a quiet dad who fixed trucks. Now she knows the whole picture, and somehow that's made her prouder, not more scared." "Kids are resilient like that," Brandon said. "More resilient than most adults give them credit for." Caleb agreed, hefting the last of the mats onto the storage rack. "She handled learning about Danny and Marcus better than I expected. Asked if she could help me write to Maria's kids sometime. Wants to be pen pals with Marcus, the little one. Not—" He paused, the name still catching slightly in his throat even now. "Not the one who died. She wants to know everything, wants to carry the memory forward the same way I do. That matters more to me than I probably show." They finished closing up the gym in comfortable silence, and Caleb drove home that night with the windows cracked, the cool evening air moving through the truck, feeling for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, like the different pieces of his life, the mechanic, the officer, the father, the grieving friend, had finally begun fitting together into something whole, rather than something he had to carefully keep apart. At home, Lily was waking up later than her usual bedtime, curled on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading, clearly anticipating his arrival. "How was the training thing?" she asked, sitting up as he came through the door. "Good," Caleb said, dropping onto the couch beside her, exhaustion settling pleasantly into his bones, the way it did after honest, meaningful work. "Group's growing. Tommy's doing better. Even Brandon's turning into somebody I actually respect." "The guy you beat up?" "I didn't beat him up," Caleb corrected, smiling. "I just proved a point. There's a difference." "Same thing," Lily said, unconvinced, snuggling into his side. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you miss being a soldier? Like, do you wish you were still doing that instead of fixing cars?" Caleb considered the question seriously, the way he tried to consider everything she asked, giving her honesty, even when honesty was complicated. "I miss some parts of it," he admitted. I miss the people mostly, the bond you build with guys you trust your life to. But I don't miss the job itself, not really. Being your dad is the best job I've ever had, Bug. Nothing about the Navy ever came close to how much I love this coming home to you every night, making grilled cheese on Fridays, hearing about your day. That training program tonight, that's not me trying to go back to who I used to be. It's me trying to use what I learned back then to help other people find their way to something like what I have now, something ordinary and good. Lily was quiet for a moment, processing that with the particular seriousness she brought to conversations that mattered to her. I think that's a really good way to be a hero, she finally said. Not the fighting part, the helping people after part. Caleb pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, feeling something settle deep and warm in his chest. Not the relief of danger past, not the satisfaction of a fight won, but something quieter and more durable than either, the simple, steady certainty that whatever else had changed in the weeks since that Friday night at Iron Valley, the thing that mattered most had only grown stronger, more solid, more true. That's the only kind of hero I ever wanted to be, he said quietly. The kind who comes home. Sunday morning before church, Ray showed up at Caleb's house with 2 coffees and a look on his face that told Caleb this wasn't a casual visit. "You got a minute?" Ray asked, settling into a chair at the kitchen table while Lily colored quietly in the next room, half listening to cartoons. "Always for you," Caleb said, sliding into the seat across from him. "Something wrong?" "Not wrong exactly." Ray turned his coffee cup slowly between his hands, working up to whatever he'd come to say. "I've been thinking a lot since that night at Iron Valley. About you mostly. About how long you'd been sitting on all that, the Navy stuff, the friends you lost, all of it, without ever once mentioning a word of it to me. 4 years, Caleb. 4 years of being friends, and I didn't know the first real thing about who you used to be." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, an old defensiveness rising before he consciously pushed it back down. "It wasn't personal, Ray. I wasn't hiding it from you specifically. I was hiding it from everybody, myself included some days." "I get that now," Ray said. "I do, but it made me realize something, and it's been eating at me since. I never told you about my brother." Caleb blinked, caught off guard. "Your brother? Danny no different." "Danny not yours. My brother Kevin. Served 2 tours in Iraq, came home different the way it sounds like some of these guys in your program come home different. Never got the help he needed. Nobody around here really knew how to give it to him back then. Not the way you're doing it now. He took his own life about 11 years ago. I don't talk about it. Ever. Not to my wife, barely to my own parents anymore." Ray's voice had gone rough, unsteady, and Caleb reached across the table without hesitation, gripping his friend's shoulder. "Ray, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Nobody does," Ray said. "That's kind of the point I'm making. I spent 11 years thinking silence was the respectful way to carry it, like talking about it would somehow dishonor him, or make it too real or something. I never fully worked out in my own head. Watching you these past few weeks, watching what you're building with these guys, watching you finally let some of your own weight show instead of carrying it alone. It's made me realize I've been doing exactly what you were doing, except without any of the good that's come from you finally putting it down." Caleb sat with that for a long moment, the weight of what his friend had just shared settling heavily between them. "You want to come to one of the sessions?" Caleb asked gently. "It's mostly veterans, but we've had a few family members sit in too. Might help having a space to say his name out loud." Ray was quiet, considering it something vulnerable crossing his usually easygoing face. "Yeah," he finally said. "Yeah, I think I might. Been carrying Kevin's name alone for too long. Maybe it's time I stopped." "You're never carrying anything alone anymore," Caleb said. "Not if I've got anything to say about it." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, 2 friends who'd just discovered a deeper, more honest layer to a friendship they'd both underestimated. And in the next room, Lily's cartoon show hummed on, oblivious, while she colored a picture of what looked suspiciously like a superhero in a flight suit, humming quietly to herself, entirely unaware of the quiet, important healing happening at the kitchen table just a few feet away. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm, one that still held all the familiar shapes of Caleb's old life. The shop, the grilled cheese Fridays, Lily's school schedule, the ordinary work of raising a daughter alone, but now carried something additional running alongside it, a second thread woven carefully into the first. Wednesday nights belonged to the gym to Tommy and Ray and Walt, and the growing circle of men learning slowly that carrying their weight didn't have to mean carrying it in silence. Sunday afternoons occasionally brought Maria and her kids out for a visit, Marcus peppering Caleb with aircraft questions, while Sophia and Lily disappeared into whatever elaborate imaginary game they'd invented that week. And every single night without fail, Caleb tucked his daughter into bed, said the names of Danny and Marcus quietly to himself, the way he always had, and found, for the first time in 4 years, that the ritual no longer felt like grief alone. It felt like gratitude too, finally allowed to sit beside the sorrow instead of being crowded out by it. One evening in late autumn, as the program session wound down and the last of the men filtered out into the cool night air, Tommy approached Caleb with something folded in his hands, a piece of paper carefully creased. "Wrote something," Tommy said, awkward, clearly uncertain whether to hand it over. "For the next newsletter thing Frank wants to put out about the program. Wanted you to read it first, make sure it's okay." Caleb unfolded the paper and read slowly Tommy's careful, halting handwriting, describing 18 months of silence, of isolation, of a grandfather's worry and a mother's exhaustion. And then in the final paragraph, describing a phone call from a mechanic he'd never met, and a gym session that had taught him for the first time since coming home that his weight didn't have to be carried in a room by himself. "This is good, Tommy," Caleb said, voice thick. "This is really good. You should be proud of writing this." "Wouldn't have anything to write if you hadn't picked up that phone," Tommy said. "Figured you should know that. Whatever that fight cost you, whatever trouble it caused, it was worth it. At least for me it was." Caleb folded the paper carefully and handed it back. Watching Tommy walk out into the parking lot toward his truck, taller somehow than he'd been that first awkward visit to the shop weeks earlier. Steadier, more settled in his own skin. He drove home that night, thinking about Ray's brother, about Danny and Marcus, about the strange, unpredictable chain of events that had started with a text message about easy money, and had somehow, against every expectation, ended up here in a gym full of men learning to carry their weight differently. In a friendship deepened by shared grief, finally spoken aloud in a daughter who now understood her father more fully than she ever had before, and loved him no less for it, maybe even more. He pulled into his driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the quiet dark, looking at the warm light glowing from his kitchen window, where Mrs. Dawson, who'd started watching Lily on Wednesday evenings for these sessions, was undoubtedly finishing up some elaborate craft project with his daughter at the table. $500. That's what he'd walked into that warehouse for. He almost laughed sitting there in the dark at how small that number seemed, now weighed against everything it had ended up costing him, and everything it had ended up giving him in return. A friend's brother finally spoken of. After 11 years of silence, a young man's ego cracked open into something better, a room full of veterans learning to breathe again, a daughter prouder of her father than she'd ever been, and Caleb Whitmore himself, finally after 4 long careful years, no longer carrying the weight of who he used to be as something to hide, but as something to stand on. He got out of the truck and walked inside toward the warm light and his daughter's voice already calling out to tell him about her day. And for the first time since that Friday night at Iron Valley, the quiet mechanic from Westbridge felt completely and without reservation at home in his own life. Spring came to Westbridge the way it always did. Slow and unhurried, the kind of season that gave a town time to remember who it was before winter had made everyone forget. Caleb noticed it most in the shop's open bay door, propped now instead of shut against the cold, the smell of cut grass drifting in from the lot outside mixing with motor oil, and the particular optimism that came with warmer light. He was elbow-deep in a carburetor when Lily burst through the office door, backpack still on, waving a piece of paper over her head like a small flag of victory. "Dad! Dad, look!" Caleb wiped his hands and took the paper, and there in careful, proud 9-year-old handwriting, she'd had a birthday since that first Friday night, turned 9 just after New Year's, and had informed him solemnly that 9 felt very different from 8. though she could never articulate exactly how was an essay titled My Hero complete, with a hand-drawn illustration of a man in a flight suit standing next to a boxy little truck. Teacher wants us to read them out loud next week, Lily said, practically vibrating with excitement. I wrote about you, about the Navy stuff and the fight and the program you started for Tommy and everybody. Mrs. Alvarez said it was the best one she's read all year. Caleb scanned the essay, throat tightening at the earnest, unguarded honesty of it, a 9-year-old's plain, unpolished version of everything that had happened since that Friday night, ending with a line that hit him harder than he expected. My dad used to be a secret hero, but now he's just a hero, and I like this way better, because now everybody gets to know how brave he is, not just me. This is really good, Bug, he said, voice rougher than he intended. I'm proud of you for writing this. I'm proud of you for being the reason I got to write it, she said, already bounding back toward the office to grab her water bottle, entirely unaware of how completely those words had landed, how they settled into a place in Caleb's chest that had once held nothing but careful, guarded silence. He set the paper down on the workbench next to the framed photograph he'd hung there a few months back. Danny and Marcus grinning in the sun somewhere overseas. A photograph Maria had insisted he keep for himself, said it belonged in whatever space he spent his working hours, so they'd always be close by watching over the life he'd built in their absence. The Wednesday night program had grown to nearly 30 men by that spring, spilling out of Frank's gym and into a converted community center room the town council had offered free of charge, once word reached them of what was happening there each week. Ray came, every session now had for months, had finally stood up one night and said his brother's name out loud for the first time in 11 years. Kevin and the room had gone quiet, and then gently full of men who understood exactly what that single word had cost him to say. Brandon had earned his own small following among the younger veterans, guys closer to his own age, who related to him in a way they sometimes struggled to relate to Caleb, or the older men. And Frank had started talking half-joking about turning the whole thing into something more permanent, a real non-profit proper funding, maybe even expanding to neighboring towns. Tommy Pruitt. A year removed from the guarded, hollow-eyed young man who'd first shown up at Caleb's shop, was helping run intake now for new members sitting with nervous first-timers, the way Caleb had once sat with him, offering the particular hard-won comfort of somebody who'd walked the exact same road. Funny how that works, Caleb said to him one evening, watching Tommy talk a visibly anxious new arrival through his first breathing exercise. You spend a year thinking you're the one who needs saving, and then you turn around and you're the one doing the saving. Learn from the best, Tommy said, and there was nothing awkward in it anymore. No hesitation. Just simple, easy gratitude between two men who understood each other completely. That night, after the session ended and Caleb had driven home under a sky just beginning to soften into the long blue evenings of early summer, he found Lily waiting for him on the porch steps, still in her pajamas, hair damp from her bath, clutching something in her hands. Couldn't sleep, he asked, sitting down beside her. Wanted to give you this before bed. She held out a small, carefully folded piece of paper, and Caleb opened it to find another drawing. This one simpler than her school essay's illustration, just two stick figures standing side by side in front of a little building labeled Whitmore Auto in her careful, uneven printing, and above them, in bigger letters, 3 words, My Whole World. Caleb sat there on the porch steps in the fading light, holding a 9-year-old's drawing of everything that mattered, and thought back, as he sometimes still did, though less painfully now than it once had been, to that Friday night 4 seasons ago. Walking into a warehouse with nothing but a text message from Ray, and $140 to his name, needing $500 more, just to keep one small promise to his daughter. Dad? Lily leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you ever think about that night, the fight? Sometimes, he admitted. Usually when I least expect it. A smell, a sound, something on the news. It comes back. Does it make you sad? Caleb considered the question honestly, the way he always tried to with her. Not sad exactly. More like grateful in a strange way. I walked into that warehouse thinking I was just solving a money problem. I didn't know I was about to solve a whole lot of other problems too, ones I didn't even know I still had. Like the sad mornings, Lily said quietly, remembering the conversation from months earlier, the one that had cracked open everything between them. Like the sad mornings, Caleb agreed. They're not gone completely. I don't think they ever fully will be, but they're lighter now, easier to carry. And I think a big part of that is because I finally stopped trying to carry them by myself. Lily was quiet for a moment, watching a firefly blink lazily across the yard. And then she said with the same devastating directness that had always been her particular gift, "I'm glad Brandon bet you that money, even though it sounds like it was kind of a mean thing for him to do at first." Caleb laughed softly. "It was a little mean, yeah, but people can start out mean and end up someplace a lot better if they're willing to actually look at themselves honestly. Brandon did that. Took him getting humbled pretty badly to get there, but he did it. Like you had to get found out to stop hiding," Lily said. And Caleb looked down at her, struck, not for the first time, by how much wisdom lived inside such a small, ordinary evening. Inside a 9-year-old girl who somehow always managed to say the truest thing in the room without even trying. "Exactly like that," he said quietly. He hadn't understood. Not really, not until this very moment, sitting on his own porch steps, with his daughter's drawing in his hands, that he'd actually walked into that warehouse, carrying something far larger than $500 worth of desperation. He'd walked in carrying 9 years of unspoken grief, 4 years of careful hiding, and a whole life's worth of strength he'd convinced himself the world no longer needed to see. Brandon Keller had bet against a mechanic that Friday night, certain he already knew exactly who would win. He'd been right about one thing at least. The fight had never really been close. He'd simply been wrong about which kind of strength would end up winning it. Not the strength that needed an audience to prove itself. Not the strength built on trophies and reputation and the fear of other men. But the older, quieter, far more durable kind. The strength of a father who showed up every single day for the person who needed him most. The strength of a man who finally let his oldest grief stand in the light, instead of burying it beneath silence. The strength of a whole town, learning one Wednesday night at a time that real courage was never about how hard a man could hit. It was about how much weight he was willing to help someone else carry, once he'd finally learned to stop carrying his own alone. Lily yawned against his shoulder sleep, finally catching up with her, and Caleb scooped her up, the way he had 100 times before carrying her inside, tucking her into bed beneath the same blanket she'd had since she was small, smoothing her hair back from her forehead, the way he did every single night without fail. "Love you, Dad," she murmured, already half asleep. "Love you more, Bug," he said, the way he always did, the answer as automatic and as true as anything he'd ever said in his life. He stood in her doorway for a long moment afterward, watching her breathe slow and even safe and unafraid. And then he walked back out to the porch. Alone, sat down where they'd been sitting together, and looked out at the quiet street where his ordinary, extraordinary life continued on, exactly as it should. No cameras, no crowds, no applause. Just a father who had finally learned to carry both who he used to be and who he'd become without letting either one crush the other beneath its weight. That was the whole truth of it. The truth the warehouse crowd had never understood, and Brandon Keller had needed a humiliating defeat to finally learn. Real strength doesn't announce itself, doesn't perform for an audience, doesn't need the world's applause to know its own worth. It simply shows up quietly, faithfully, for the people who need it most. A daughter waiting on a porch step, a stranger's grandson lost and searching for solid ground. A friend finally brave enough to say a lost brother's name out loud after 11 long years of silence. Caleb Whitmore had walked into that warehouse a desperate, ordinary man chasing $500, and he had walked out in every way that mattered, something far more valuable than money could ever buy. A life fully reclaimed, a past finally at peace with a present worth protecting, and a daughter who would grow up knowing without a single shadow of doubt exactly what real courage looked like. A week later, on the night Lily read her essay aloud to her whole class, Caleb stood quietly in the back of the classroom among the other parents, arms crossed, throat tight, listening to his daughter's small, steady voice describe a man in work boots who used to carry secrets, the way other men carried tools, and who had learned eventually that the bravest thing he ever did wasn't anything that happened inside that warehouse ring at all. My dad says real heroes don't need people to be scared of them. Lily read, glancing up once to find him in the crowd, a small private smile passing between them, before she looked back down at her paper. They just need to show up for the people who need them. My dad shows up for me every single day, and now he shows up for a whole room full of other people too. That's why he's my hero. Not because he can win a fight, because he never stopped trying to come home. The classroom broke into applause, gentle and warm, the kind reserved for 9-year-olds, and the fathers lucky enough to be written about so plainly, so completely. And Caleb stood there in the back of that room, clapping along with everyone else, feeling something settle inside him that no warehouse crowd, no viral video, no article ever could have given him. Not fame, not vindication. Just this, a daughter who knew him fully and without reservation, and loved every piece of what she knew. Afterward, walking her out to the truck in the fading afternoon light, Lily slipped her small hand into his, the way she'd done since she was old enough to walk, and Caleb held it the way he always had, steady, certain, unwilling to ever let it go. Some men spent their whole lives chasing the kind of respect that came from a crowd's applause, from trophies on a shelf, from strangers online, calling them brave. Caleb Whitmore had learned the hard way in a warehouse he never should have walked into, that the only respect worth having was the kind that lived quietly in a 9-year-old's steady handwriting, in a friend's brother's name, finally spoken aloud, in a room full of veterans, learning to breathe again, the respect that asked for nothing in return, and gave everything anyway. That in the end was the whole story. Not a mechanic who turned out to be a hero. A hero who had simply finally remembered how to be a man again, one quiet, faithful day at a time.